Civilization has shaped the world we live in today. Humans' ability to civilize areas of the world has been integral to the development of both socialization and culture. It allows us humans to live in safety, and it also gives us an identity. Civilizations usually consist of a government which brings along laws and a social pyramid, as well as a religion that is followed by the majority of the population. We know people haven't always lived in civilizations. Look at hunter-gatherers, for example. They travel around making temporary settlements. So where in our long and in-depth story did civilization begin? And how has it developed since its dawn? Hopefully, in today's video, we can answer some of those questions, as well as learn some new and interesting facts about these early civilizations. Enjoy. Ultimately, it's hard to define what makes a civilization, but most anthropologists agree on some criteria to define a society as a civilization. First, civilization has some kind of urban settlement and are not nomadic. With support from the other people living in the settlement, labour is divided up into specific jobs, so not everyone has to focus on growing their own food. From this specialization comes class structure and government, both aspects of civilization. Another critical part for civilization is a surplus of food, which comes from having tools to aid in growing crops, writing, trading, artwork and monuments, and development of sciences and technology are all aspects of civilization. There are many societies that scholars consider civilizations that do not meet all the criteria above. For example, the Incan Empire was a large civilization with a government and social hierarchy. It left behind a wealth of art and had highly developed architecture, but no written language. This is why the concept of civilization is hard to define. Civilizations surprisingly have a lot in common with smaller human societies. Art, culture, laws, technology, and a clear structure of leadership are prominent in both. So what makes civilization so different? One difference between the two is the presence of cities and urban areas, which are the result of a large population. But you don't need large pieces of land to make a civilization. Take the Easter Island civilization, for example, hemmed in on a small island. The early inhabitants of Easter Island learned that the island was prime for agriculture. The crops were abundant enough for them to invest work into other things that didn't produce any food. And so they developed a tradition of building big rectangular stone platforms where to bury their kings and important people, later followed by the famous Maui statues. Easter Island developed its own language, writing system, monarchy, and of course had flourishing farms. All this means that they didn't need to move, which suggested that the population built up over generations of living in the same area, reaching estimates of 15 to 20,000 people, meaning more houses, jobs, and classes of wealth and importance, which results in towns, cities, meaning there are urban areas, which defines civilization. But when defining a civilization becomes very difficult, is when we try to categorize societies like the Zulu and the previously mentioned Incas. Zulus have their own social structure in the form of a pyramid, being the king at the top. They also had what could be considered cities, although they were more like war camps, the capital being Mngunguluvu. But these so-called cities rarely outlasted their builders, and it was common for a new Zulu king to construct a new capital after he ascended the throne. The Zulu were a warlike people, so they were constantly on the move, looking for the next village or city to pillage. This is why they constructed their cities out of wood and thatch, unlike other African cities that were made from stone. Acting as a pastoralist community in which they kept at the heart of their cities with the surrounding layers occupied by the people. They mostly spoke the same language and also had a religion, but had no written language. My point being is that, can we consider the Zulu a civilization? They had many characteristics of a civilization. Cities housing upwards of 20,000 people, but lacking urban areas. Language, but lacking literary language. Farming, but lacking a large surplus in reliable food. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. There are some clear characteristics of a civilization. These include large population centres, monumental architecture and unique art styles, shared communication strategies, systems for administrating territories, a complex diversion of labour, and the diversion of people into social and economic classes. We can use this to help define a civilization, even though the definition can get a bit hazy. Civilization is birthed from the emergence of agriculture, which encouraged people to make a radical switch in lifestyle, living in one place and tending to fields rather than wandering the landscape. And for whatever reason, that development and that decision was made independently around the world countless times. There's one vital place in the world when determining where the first civilization came from, and that's southern Mesopotamia, which had been labelled Sumer. The earliest population known to have inhabited this vital land was the Ubaid people. The Ubaidian people made vital strides for early civilization by draining the marshes for agriculture, developing trade, and establishing industries including weaving, leatherwork, metalwork, masonry, and pottery. Here is also the oldest evidence of crop domestication. The first domesticated plants in Mesopotamia were wheat, barley, lentils, and types of peas. People in other parts of the world, including Eastern Asia, parts of Africa, parts of North and South America, also domesticated plants. Other plants that were cultivated by early civilizations include rice in Asia and potatoes in South America. About the same time they domesticated plants, people in Mesopotamia began to tame animals for meat, milk, and hides. Hides, or the skins of animals, were used for clothing, storage, and to build tents for shelter. Goats were probably the first animals to be domesticated, followed closely by sheep. In Southeast Asia, chickens were also domesticated about 10,000 years ago. Later, people began domesticating larger animals, such as oxen or horses, for ploughing and transportation. These are known as beasts of burden. The Akkadian people may have also been the first civilization, and this is where things start to become dependent on how you define civilization. Ubaid culture is characterized by large unwalled village settlements, multi-roomed rectangular mud brick houses, and the appearance of the first temples of public architecture in Mesopotamia, with a growth of a two-tier settlement hierarchy of centralized large sites of more than 10 hectares, surrounded by smaller village sites of less than 1 hectare. Distinctive fine quality buff or greenish coloured pottery, decorated with geometric designs in brown or black paint, have been discovered at the sites. This is just one of few representations of how advanced the Ubaidian people were. During the Ubaid period, 5000 to 4000 BC, the movement towards urbanization began. This was led by the agriculture and animal domestication development that was widely practiced in Ubaidian communities. There were also tribes that practiced domesticating animals as far north as Turkey. The Ubaid period, based upon analysis of grave goods, was one of increasingly polarized social stratification and decreasing utilitarianism, which is all characteristic of a civilization. Actually, the only thing the Ubaidian people lack that other civilizations don't is written language. But as established before, not all civilizations have been known to possess written language. What a lot of people argue, including me, is that the Ubaidians were a proto-historic civilization, which is basically the transition period between nomadic cultures and full flourishing civilizations. The reality is, civilizations emerge slowly and the Ubaidians were a part of it. The only reason we landmark the Sumerians is because they were the first known people to develop written language and are a clear, by all definitions, civilization. Between the years 4000 and 3100 BC, named after the Sumerian city of Uruk, was the Uruk period. This period saw the rapid expansion of urban life in Mesopotamia and the Sumerian civilization. Archaeological surveys seem to indicate that Uruk, by 3500 BC, had a population of 25,000 people. It was in the Uruk period that a group of people, whose origin is unknown, mixed with the Ubaidian people, adopting Ubaid culture as well as adding parts of their own. We know this because during the early Uruk period, there was a gradual development from Ubaidian culture to the new Sumerian culture. The archaeological transition from the Ubaid period to the Uruk period is marked by a gradual shift from painted pottery domestically produced on slow wheels to a great variety of unpainted pottery mass-produced by specialists on fast wheels. The Uruk period is a continuation and an outgrowth of the Ubaidian period, with pottery being the main visible change. By the time of the Uruk period, the volume of trade goods transported along the canal and rivers of southern Mesopotamia facilitated the rise of many large, stratified temple-centered cities, with populations of over 10,000 people, where centralized administrations employed specialized workers. It is certain that it was during the Uruk period that Sumerian cities began to make use of slave labor captured from the hill country, and there is ample evidence for captured slaves as workers in the earliest texts. Artifacts and even colonies of this period of Sumerian civilization have been found over a wide area, from the Taurus Mountains in Turkey to the Mediterranean Sea in the west, and as far east as western Iran. Sumerian cities during the Uruk period were probably theocratic and were most likely headed by a priest-king, who the Sumerians called Ensi, who was assisted by a council of elders, including both men and women. It is quite possible that the later Sumerian pantheon was modelled upon this political structure. There is little evidence of organised warfare or professional soldiers during the Uruk period, and towns were generally unwalled. During this period, Uruk became the most urbanised city in the world, surpassing for the first time 50,000 inhabitants. It was also during the mid to late Uruk period that the first known trace of writing was created using clay for the tablets and reeds for the styluses. Writing evolved when someone decided to replace the pointed drawing tool with a triangular reed stylus. The reed could be pressed easily and quickly into the clay to make wedges. At first, the wedges were grouped to make pictures, but slowly the groups evolved into more abstract signs and became the sophisticated script that we call cuneiform. About 1,000 signs represented the names of objects and also stood for words, syllables, and sounds. Cuneiform records provide information about bureaucracy and authority, but they also document many fascinating aspects of daily life. Written texts reveal how individuals and families expressed their wishes, married and had children, did business and worshipped. People wrote mainly on clay, but also on more expensive materials such as this golden plaque. It is from this point that we can learn and understand Sumerian culture with greater detail. With the end of the Uruk period, the Dynastic period had begun. The Dynastic period was associated with a shift from the temple establishment headed by a council of elders led by the priestly En towards a more secular Lugal. The centre of Sumerian culture remained in southern Mesopotamia, even though rulers soon began expanding into neighbouring areas, and neighbouring Semitic groups adopted much of the Sumerian culture for their own. The earliest dynastic king on the Sumerian king list, whose name is known from any other legendary source, is Etana, 13th king of the first dynasty of Kish. But the Sumerian king list isn't exactly a reliable source, as it seems to be a combination of myth, legend, and historical information. as highlighted by the many kings who supposedly reigned for well over 1,000 years. The earliest king authenticated through archaeological evidence is Mbaragesi of Kish, whose name is also mentioned in the Epic of Gilgamesh, leading to the suggestion that Gilgamesh himself might have been a historical king of Uruk. As the Epic of Gilgamesh shows, this period was associated with increased war. Cities became walled and increased in size as undefended villages in southern Mesopotamia disappeared. The Sumerian king list presents kingship as a divine gift that has been bestowed upon mankind in primordial times, and that it was passed down from king to king. In the Sumerian list of kings, it is said, as mentioned previously, that kings were appointed by the gods and was therefore divinely chosen, meaning who became king would have ultimately been decided by whoever was in power of the religion. Technically, there were multiple kings of Sumerian civilization, as each city was a city-state. There were many battles and wars between cities over territory and resources, and it wasn't until Sargon the Great that Sumer was united under one ruler. Sumerian civilization was finally united when Sargon the Great rose to power in North Mesopotamia. He established his own city named Akkad. When the powerful Sumerian city of Uruk attacked his city, he fought back and eventually conquered Uruk. He then went on to conquer all Sumerian city-states and united northern and southern Mesopotamia under a single ruler. Thus began the rule of the Akkadian Empire, which seen Sargon send Akkadian governors to rule Sumerian cities and tear down defensive walls. He left the Sumerian religion in place, but made Akkadian the official language of all Mesopotamia. By lowering physical and linguistic barriers and unifying his realm, he promoted commerce both within Mesopotamia and well beyond. Akkadian, a Semitic language, gradually replaced Sumerian as a spoken language in the area. But Sumerian continued to be used as a sacred, ceremonial, literary and scientific language in Akkadian-speaking Mesopotamian states such as Assyria and Babylonia until the 1st century AD. The Akkadian Empire held the region until the invasion of the Gutians, who ruled until they were driven out by Ur-Nammu and his son Shulgi of Ur, who were responsible for the so-called Sumerian Renaissance, which saw a rebirth of Sumerian culture following the Akkadian and Gutian conquests. The Sumerian civilization collapsed in 1750 BCE with the invasion of the region by the Elamites. Shulgi of Ur had erected a great wall in 2083 BCE to protect his people from such an invasion, but as it was not anchored at either end, it could easily be walked around, which is precisely what the invaders did. Even so, the culture had been struggling to retain its autonomy ever since the Amorites had gained power in Babylon. The ruling Elamites were eventually absorbed into the Amorite culture, becoming the Babylonians, and marked the end of the Sumerians as a distinct body of the rest of Mesopotamia. The Sumerians were responsible for many of the important innovations, inventions, and concepts taken for granted in the present day. They essentially invented time by dividing day and night into 12-hour periods, hours into 60 minutes, and minutes into 60 seconds. Their other innovations and inventions include the first schools, the earliest version of the tale of the Great Flood, and other biblical narratives, governmental bureaucracy, monumental architecture, and irrigation techniques. After the rise of the Amorites in Mesopotamia and the invasion of the Elamites, Sumer ceased to exist and was only known through the references in the works of ancient writers, including the scribes who wrote the biblical book of Genesis. Sumer remained unknown until the 19th century, when excavations in Mesopotamia unearthed their civilization and brought their many contributions to light. Thanks for watching today's video. I hope you learned something new about the birth of civilization, as well as learning something about the civilizations mentioned in the video. If you enjoyed, please consider liking and subscribing, and if you have any thoughts, leave them in the comments below. Have a good one.